Huddle with paperplusoffice.co.nz, your local office supplies specialist, now open for business.
NewstalkZB, 21 before 6 this evening's Huddle. David Farrar and Cam Slater. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
Good evening, Susan.
The principal youth court judge has got a very fair point, doesn't he? About a third of the young offenders before the court are not in school. It would be better if they were in school, David, but then how the heck do you keep them there without, whilst looking after the other kids?
Yeah, and I think you have to be careful whether it's correlation or causation here. Look, it probably doesn't help getting kicked out of school, but the kids who do get excluded from school tend to be those who have already gone off the track. So I think you have to be careful to say that just keeping them in school by itself is going to make a huge difference. What it does come down to is that the needs of the many sadly outweigh the needs of the one there, and if they're a danger to other kids or to teachers, the school does have to act. There probably are some cases, though, like, some schools exclude people, no warning for very minor drug offences, etc. And, you have to respect different schools have different policies, etc. I do tend to think exclusion should be sort of the last resort, not the first resort, certainly.
Cam?
Yeah, look, there's a big difference between, like David says, with minor drug offences or issues like that. But when you've got elements of violence and repeated violence, removing them from the school is probably the best option. But the trouble is what they go to. And, there are alternative education systems out there which are really a last resort for these kids. But by the time they get to those, the damage is already done. And it's not really the schools that are causing the damage. No. It's their home life and their parenting. And, I know of kids that are in these sorts of organisations where they're using marijuana, but they're using marijuana because they really don't want to use methamphetamine, which is what their parents use. And they don't have to pay for it either because their parents give it to them. And so that's where the issue lies, is at the home level. But what do you do about it? I mean, the Judge Beecroft has always been sort of an ambulance at the bottom of the hill type person, and it comes up with zany solutions about keeping them in school. But nobody wants drugged up violent people at school. So you have to, I don't know, maybe we have special classrooms for handicapped people and special needs people at school. Maybe we need to have special classrooms that bring in specialised tutors for these type of kids rather than
the old hostels.
But then you send them home to the environment, Cam, that you have described, and how can the school fix it, David? I think it's unreasonable expecting the schools to pick up what is a societal and actually, at the end of the day, a parental problem.
No, and the schools aren't staffed or trained in being social workers. In fact, funnily enough, there are now social workers in quite a few schools, but they can't be substitute families or substitute parents there. They have to be able to provide a safe education environment to the majority of their students. Mm.
Patrick Walsh, actually, from the Principals Association, we were talking to earlier in the hour, he talked about, there have been times in the past where you have a wraparound type thing. You actually take the kid out of the family environment. You try to keep them in school or some sort of education. I mean, that's what it takes, isn't it, to turn this around, Cam?
Yeah, it does take those sorts of interventions, but the moment you do, you get all the rowdies marching in the street, complaining about, interfering in parents' rights and children's rights and all sorts of other stuff. But the reality is that we do have, in some small percentage of the population, dysfunctional families, and they're just not working. And all of this mumbo-jumbo about the rights of people to breed willy-nilly and bring up their kids or drag them up mostly really has to take a second fiddle into actually thinking about the welfare of trying to break the cycle of really some horrific situations.
And the welfare of the child.
Is it's more and more prevalent.
Because if the kids are learning that sort of violence or maybe sexual abuse, it's happening to them at home, don't you, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And the sad thing is, by the time it's noticed at school, they might be 10 or 12. It's years too late because it's often started when they were 4
not even
or 5.
There at an earlier age, because what happens with the school system is, and the teachers have lobbied for this, is they want everyone to stick together, so they push them through, and they push them through with their age group, and then they get to 15 and 16, all the hormones kick in, and on top of that, all the drug use that they've got, and the learned behaviour that they've had of getting away with everything, and they turn into right little Sebastians, and you can't actually deal with it. It's too late. And so they fall through the cracks, and the judge is right in that respect. But how do you fix society that has let this happen over 30 or 40 years?
I don't know. We'll take a break on that point and ponder it further. David Farrar, Cam Slater going to come back and talk about rates. Are you happy with the nice-to-haves being paid for by your rates at 16 to 6? It is 14 to 6, the Huddle this evening. David Farrar, Cam Slater. Let me just read you an email that's just come in from Craig Jepson. This about the councils wanting to keep the social, cultural, environmental and economic well-beings in their mandate. With 500% increases in rates at Kaipara, why the hell would we want to give councils any other role than basic services? They've proven track records of incompetence and, like any government, think they have a right to spend our money on their pipe dreams without a jot of fiscal responsibility. And David, I think a lot of people may feel like that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the unanimous statement that we want to be able to keep spending money on whatever we want to is almost like a bunch of kids who've been told their pocket money is getting turned off. What you need to look at is rates have gone up on average 7% a year since they were given these powers of general competence to do anything.
They never go down.
No.
They never go down. And people can't afford 7% annual pay rises because our wages do not increase by that much. It's unsustainable. And I think absolute strength of the government to pare them back. Plus, actually, it makes government more accountable. When you've got local government doing stuff that central government's meant to do, you just end up with people not knowing who's responsible.
Cam, do you want to get a word in there?
Well, look, I absolutely agree with your emailer. And the problem goes back to the local body reforms of the previous Labor government, where they allowed this general competence rule to come in. And what that actually bred was general incompetence. And I think we actually have to get away from talking about rates, because rates in the old sense of the term were to provide for, muck,
rubbish,
the
water,
and services. What we've got now is actually general taxation on the populace, and they're actually taxes. Now, no one in New Zealand would tolerate a central government increasing taxes by 7% year on year every year in order to fund all of the obligations that are out there. We would be throwing those governments out onto the street, and we need to actually start focusing people's thoughts on that. This isn't rates anymore. It is taxation, and it is by force and by almost every council in the country.
And on top of that, David, they have brought in user pays or more of it. So you try to build a house. And just work out what the fees are, because it'll be tens of thousands of dollars. You are charged for absolutely everything, and maybe that's right. But everything has gone up, David.
Well, councils are the major reason why we have such a housing affordability issue, because they refuse to free up land, and the constraints they've put on people being able to build houses are now so tough that you've got a 15,000 house shortage in Auckland.
And then previously they didn't do the job properly, which is why we got the leaky house issue. But anyhow,
exactly.
And then we as ratepayers are now having to pay that.
And what did they do when the leaky house situation came along? They absolved themselves of all responsibility, tried to blame the government for it, and ran away from the issue. So general competence only seems to apply to picking our pockets, but it doesn't apply for actually, taking ownership of the decisions that the council has made.
It was interesting talking to Lawrence Yule earlier. He did admit, they want to keep the power, and that's what they want it for. I don't know about you guys, but I watched the protests over the weekend, and a few thousand people, anti-asset sales. That's absolutely fine. I do not have a problem with people protesting it. It's absolutely their right. But there were a number of them reported they were rude, they were abusive, they were actually expletive-laden rants against, and it got pretty personal. And I don't like seeing that against personal politicians. Maybe, am I being old school, David?
No, they don't do their cause any help at all when they act like this. I think the guillotining effigies is actually quite offensive, because this isn't some secret policy brought out after the election. This is a policy that you might honestly disagree with it, but the government announced 10 months before the election, there was a 10-month campaign about, and they got elected on. So to be going and having mock executions of politicians because they're keeping their promise, I think it's a very stupid thing.
Last word, Cameron.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It's basically a bunch of, rowdies, ne'er-do-wells and deadbeat dads all walking up the street wanting to maintain something that they actually don't really care too much about, other than having a protest and trying to slag off John Key.
Very good to talk to you both, David Farrar and Cameron Slater. It's 9 to 6. We'll talk sport next.